Greg, you are very active in both working with, consulting with, advising and strategically advising different place management organizations and the ecosystem, both in the public sector and the private sector that interact with place management organizations. You do this not only in your home base in London, but across Europe and indeed in countries around the world in Asia. So you're well versed in the subject matter that we're exploring as part of this Urban Thinkers Campus. I'm wondering if you could offer some reflections on kind of very high-level international trends that you see associated with place management organizations. And specifically, I'm very interested in your perspective on whether we need these organizations as a way of advancing sustainable urbanism, or whether they're only kind of a nice-to-have amenity in cities. And then finally, any observations or reflections that you have with respect to the reporting structures associated with these organizations, and whether there is an opportunity there to innovate practice. Greg, thanks so much. Sorry about the technical challenges here this morning.
No problem. And firstly, let me say good morning to you and all your colleagues there in Washington and joining us virtually. And it's a pleasure to join you from London. Let me say very quickly, Uwe, that I think the big story here is the story, of course, of global urbanization. I tend to think of this as from 1980 to 2080, there's a century of cities. We're multiplying by 2 the percentage of people who live in cities, by 4 the number of people who live in cities, and by 6 the number of cities of over 1 million people, which means that the imperative of place management and of place leadership is just becoming a deeper imperative in many, many places, not just in the capital cities or the gateway cities or the hub cities, but in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and tier cities. In every nation, there's a desire to make better place and for us to make urbanization work. We can't make urbanization work unless we manage place. The second big trend, of course, is the shift towards managing places that are not just commercially successful, but to manage places in such a way that they create different forms of commercial success. There's a difference between a business district, an innovation district, a logistics district, an experience district, an entertainment district. These are all different kinds of places that need to provide different kinds of services and experiences to different kinds of workers, customers, residents, and others. So we have a big diversity of different kinds of activities. But commercial success is no longer the only thing we want from districts. We also want them to be inclusive, we want them to be sustainable, and we want them to be places that provide, particularly in the post-pandemic environment, a kind of compelling pull. So the third point I would make, the third big trend, is that since the pandemic, in many parts of the world, people have a different set of choices about which sorts of places they wish to visit. And therefore, we see a changed pattern of use of urban districts, of urban places, if you like, differences in the way people work, how they consume, how they enjoy themselves, when they will and when they won't travel, and where they choose to live. And a big consequence of this is that places are now in a new competition, not just with each other, but places are in competition with non-place, with digital platforms. And if you like, there's a competition now between place and space that we didn't used to have before. And therefore, if we're interested in the activities that require face-to-face and face-to-place, as opposed to face-to-space, then what we have to do is really think about how to make that a unique experience. So I would summarize it by saying place management in this part of the 21st century, as we move to halfway through that century of the city requires us to focus on places that provide habitat in a way that will be sustainably habitable, that provide innovation in the sense that they're places of creativity where you can do things that you can't do online. And they have to, of course, provide experience that can't be had in a virtual location. So habitat, innovation, and experience, that would be my motif. Now, your second question was, are place management organizations necessary to do this? And my answer, broadly speaking, is yes, I think they are. I think that particularly in the post-pandemic environment, there's a new agility in the way that urban spaces and places work. They have to perform different roles on different days of the week, different times of the day, different seasons of the year. They have to be much more adaptive than they used to be. The single-use office district or the single-use retail district really doesn't work anymore. That's not the habitat, innovation, and experience that we all want. So we need a management vehicle that's able to deliver variety, change, spontaneity, a different mix at different times. That has to be curated, it has to be coordinated, and it has to be communicated constantly. So urban management platforms are really needed. And of course, you know very well, there are many different kinds of them. There's all of the special purpose districts, but there's also lots of different agencies and management companies in different parts of the world. So generally speaking, yes, we need them, because without them, we can't provide that curated, coordinated, and communicated experience. There are one or two examples, I think, where you don't need a special purpose entity to do it. And that's either where you've got a single owner for a whole location, and they're able to provide both to the tenants within that location and to all of the visitors and workers and everything else some of that experience. And you see this, of course, in many of the cities in the Middle East. You see it increasingly in cities in Southeast Asia, where very large whole districts of a city are owned by a single company that provides that service. You see this, for example, in Lake Nona in Florida. You'll see this in Masdar City in Abu Dhabi, and you'll see it, of course, in places in the Philippines, Vietnam, and elsewhere. That's one case. The other case where you might not need it is where you've got a sufficiently small but highly capable local government that has an unusual level of resource. And so we do see that, for example, in the Nordic cities. There are no business improvement districts in central Stockholm, because actually the Stockholm City Council is a very powerful city council, and it can do those things, and it has the partnership credentials. Generally speaking, though, we do need them, Uwe.
Yes,
And
yes.
then the last thing I would say is, do they need to report and be accountable and be transparent? Absolutely, they do. Right at the heart of that habitat innovation experience equation is trust. And trust requires them to be explicit in how they report, to be accountable to a broader set of citizen stakeholders or visitors. It requires them to build metrics that are transparent, to use scorecards, and I think to be very honest about what they can do and what they can't do. So just to take one obvious example, it's not my experience that place management organizations can solve a homelessness crisis in a city. They can make a contribution by engaging with the stakeholders within their district to help homeless people and to provide them with support and services, but they can't solve the crisis, which is systemic and is part of a general challenge in housing and housing affordability. But what they can do is to demonstrate that they're doing things that are positive in that regard. So that would be my quick take on your three rather good questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's really, really interesting. And while we have you still this morning, I'm going to ask a unscripted question, but related directly to your work. And that is, could be the subject of a whole conference, but I would like you to express your thoughts and reflections on this issue of innovation itself, and both innovation within in growing the capacity and growing the reach and ability for places to thrive, but also the innovation kind of externally, which is really about broader economic innovation, innovation of the marketplace itself. You've mentioned the obvious new kind of field of competition with respect to digitization, but how do you see place-based innovation as an agenda item for these organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I like to talk about. I would say, Uwe, that the simple way to think about it is that there are three broad kinds of innovation that happen in place. So one kind of innovation is what we might call the hosting of the innovation economy, where you have often the translation of valuable technology, research, or other kinds of discovery through commercial processes into fast-growing companies that often have a very particular dynamic. They tend to cluster with each other. They tend to enjoy proximity to an anchor institution or to a large corporate. And this is what gives rise to this idea of an innovation district, where you have a higher proportion of these faster growing, smaller companies trading in these new technologies or the commercialization of these new discoveries. And creating an innovation district or fostering or curating one is a specialized skill set that understands the particular dynamics of those firms and what they need, and particularly what their talented workers need. That, I think, is slightly different from another kind of innovation, which I want to call urban innovation, which is essentially about innovating in the way that the place is organized and managed. So this is the innovation that happens in the built environment, or in the transport systems, or in what we might call the metabolism of the district, the water, the waste, the energy, the air quality. This is about using digital platforms to make the place work in a way which is more efficient, provides a better experience, or is more sustainable overall. Now, sometimes an innovation district that hosts an innovation economy is also a place that is a pioneer in urban innovation, but not always. And then I think there's a third kind of innovation that happens here that I would call social innovation, which includes, for example, innovation in the way that people access jobs, innovation in the way that services are provided to people, but also citizen level innovation, what we might call tactical urbanism. We might get into ideas about participation mechanisms, citizen budgeting, citizens becoming much more involved in taking control over public assets or pieces of land, citizens really working together, increasing their social capital and their levels of cooperation with one another, inventing new ways to meet human need within the district. Now, some districts will have urban innovation very deep, and we'll have some good social innovation. Some will host the innovation economy well, but not necessarily do much social innovation. And of course, the holy grail, I think, is to get districts that are good at hosting the innovation economy, have deep urban innovation in terms of their systems and experience, but also encourage social innovation to occur so that the optimum benefit can be spread amongst the largest group of people, giving them citizen agency and building their social capital as well. So that's how I see it, Uwe. And some of the place management organizations that I know do all of those things consciously. Some are only conscious of one aspect of that triangle.
Greg, just as a way of closing out here, we've spent this fall conducting workshops really around the world because of the power of Zoom. And we have really a wonderful variety of different examples of these local place management organizations. Just as a way of closing, Greg, because I know you travel to a lot of different kinds of places and different kinds of cities. I'm wondering if you would just reflect a little bit on the diversity of economies, the diversity of cultures, the diversity of levels of governance capacity in different cities. And I know you've been active in the Caribbean. You're a frequent traveler to many different places in Asia. I'm wondering if you just kind of just offer some reflections on the kind of diversity of expression of place.
Yes, okay. Well, that's a fantastic question. Let's do this in a couple of lines quickly. So clearly, we're talking, when we look at the world, of perhaps 10 regions that have different kinds of urbanization processes going on. So if you were to take North America, Latin America, Europe, and Oceania, these are all countries, regions, nations, continents where you've got 80% plus urbanization. Essentially, the urbanization model is mature, and now it's being fixed and retrofitted and revisited and reset. In the Middle East and in China and in parts of Southeast Asia, you've got an urbanization model that's between sort of 60% and 80%, where cities are still being formed and where populations are growing quite rapidly in certain cases, and whole new pieces of city are being built. And then, of course, in Africa and in India in particular, you've got very rapid urbanization still happening from a low base, and a large amount of urban kit still has to be created. Now, in each of these kinds of environments, mature but reforming, what we might say really built but now adding capacity, and then at the early stages, you've got very different requirements in terms of place management and place leadership, because what you have to do is to create places that make the logic of the city work again. So to give an obvious example, in North America, there's a big challenge to show people that the idea of a central business district that has offices and retail within it still makes sense in a digitized world, and you've got to retrofit that. Whereas if you're in Nairobi, in Kenya, and you're trying to build that city as a capital for the first time, you've got to add whole new districts and make them work. So that's one way of thinking. Another way of thinking is whether we're dealing with mature democracies, emerging democracies, or other kinds of governance models. So particularly in the Middle East, we're not really dealing with emerging or mature democracies. We're dealing with monarchies of one kind or another that have a completely different approach to taxation, to placemaking, to infrastructure. The concept of citizenship is a very different kind of concept. And here you have, in many cases, benign leaders trying to create what they think people want, but you don't have that democratic process that checks whether it's what people want or not. So right at the heart of that, you have different ideas about trust, social capital, civic partnership, and how they work. And then I think a third model would be to say that in different parts of the world, there are very different patterns of land ownership. So in some cities around the world, land ownership is highly fragmented, giving rise to a coordination imperative at the level of place that you wouldn't otherwise have. In other cities in the world, you've got very large parcels of land that are owned by a single owner. That creates a very different calculus for how you create place management entities and organizations and what's needed. In each case, though, the key challenge is that in urban districts, we have a multiplicity of activity that requires some level of coordination in order to make the place work. And we can have high coordination equilibriums where we've got a place management entity with lots of stakeholders working together. Or we can have a low coordination equilibrium where we're relying on policies or stories or narratives or nudging and influencing to make things happen. And in each culture, there's a different tolerance for whether we're going to have high coordination, medium or low. And you have to pick the form of coordination that works right for the culture that you're in. So I never recommend, for example, that in Southeast Asia, they would adopt a business improvement district, or in Africa that they would take a barrio comercial model, or that they would have, for example, an urban development corporation in India, because actually the cultures that create the entities that work in one location won't necessarily translate well to a different culture in a different setting.
Greg, you've just expressed our collective enthusiasm for cities. Every city is different. Every place has its own culture. But you know, as you've so eloquently said today, you know, this role of place and the role of organizing at the scale of place is something that we all need to pay attention to. Greg, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thanks for your patience with our technology.
Great pleasure. Great to see you.
Thank you, Greg.